I couldn't believe it when I heard it. The wedding planner, whose voice was cold and emotionless, passed me a brief message. "James has decided that you won't be at his wedding." Those words hit me like lightning. A moment that should have been the culmination of my entire life turned into a blow that shattered everything I had built. Everything I had done for him, everything I sacrificed my life for, was reduced to nothing. One phone call, one decision, and I became a stranger. How many years did I pour into his future, into his happiness? How many sleepless nights did I spend to ensure stability, to create Sterling Hospitality Group, a company so successful that I could be proud not just of myself, but of my family? I thought that if I did everything for him, he would be proud of me. But it turned out that it was just an illusion. When I started this business, I didn't know any other way to express my love and care except through money and achievements. I believed that if I was successful, if I provided them with everything they could ever want, they would appreciate it. But it turns out not everything can be bought. I lost more than money could ever give me. I lost my son. James, the one I raised, supported, and invested in for his future, decided that my presence at his wedding wasn't needed. The one I loved and protected, who was supposed to carry on my legacy, chose to live without me at the most important moment of his life. And I realized that I meant nothing to him. I had become unnecessary. When I was told of his decision, I didn't respond. Everything inside me froze. I didn't argue. I didn't try to prove anything. In that moment, I understood. Everything I had done was pointless. I wasn't invited, despite the fact that I had funded almost the entire wedding. How many years had I spent building this life for him, and now he chose his perfect image without me. I stood by the window in my office and looked at the city. The city I had built, with my own hands, my own will, my own money. I had invested not just resources, but my dreams. When I started, I believed that this would be worth not just money, but time, effort, and sacrifices. I sacrificed my personal life, relationships, hours when I wasn't there for my family. I understood that because of this work, I became a distant figure in their eyes, but I thought the result would justify everything. But now, standing by the window, I wasn't sure if it was all worth it. I glanced at the lights of the city, thinking that I would never return to those days when my children were small and needed my support. When I was their example and pillar. How many times had I given up everything for their future, and now, when all this was built on a solid foundation, James chose his life without me. In that moment, I realized that everything I had built didn't matter because his attention was directed toward ideals that were foreign to him. My heart tightened, and I felt like I was being erased from their lives. I had become just a part of the backdrop, something that could have been. But I was no longer in their plans. And although I was proud of what I had done for him and for the family, I realized that this moment was the grand fall when family ceased to be a whole world, and I became just an outsider. I often remember those days when everything started. How I sat in a small office, gritting my teeth and focusing on every step, not knowing if success would come or if everything would fall apart. Back then, I believed that if I created this empire, if everything was finely tuned, I could provide my family with everything they ever dreamed of. I worked so hard that I forgot what it was like to simply be present. I was sure that if I provided financially, gave them all the opportunities they could imagine, it would be enough to prove my love. But I was wrong. Sterling Hospitality Group was my dream. I started from nothing, from a place where many didn't even dream of anything bigger than a paycheck at the end of the month. At that time, I never thought about how many lives, how many opportunities one would lose for the sake of this success. I saw a goal ahead of me, to create a business that would allow not only me but my children to live better than I ever did. But somewhere along the way, I began to lose something much more important. I wasn't just building a business, I was building a future. My future, James's future. I began constructing all of this with the thought that my son would be proud of me, that he would see the price I paid for this success. I told myself every day that I didn't need recognition, that the most important thing was not praise, but what would come later. I did everything for their security, their comfort, their happiness. When I signed new contracts, when I worked on deals, I thought that this path would eventually lead to my children feeling secure in this world. I was ready to sacrifice anything, just so they wouldn't repeat my mistakes, wouldn't face the same struggles I did. I remember believing that year after year, Sterling would continue to grow. Each successful project, each new property, every contract, it was a step toward ensuring that James and his sister would never know what it felt like to lack. I always had that goal, to give them a future where they could do what they wanted, not just what they had to. I provided them with all the opportunities, the best schools, travel, the best housing. I gave them everything I could. But it still wasn't enough. I thought my achievements would leave a mark in their lives, that they would understand. I didn't betray them, I was just trying to make their lives better. But as the years went by, I realized more and more that I was disappearing from their real lives, that they were becoming more and more distant from me, until they were just shadows. I never told them I needed anything in return. I always thought that the most important thing was to give. But at some point, I realized that their acknowledgement no longer mattered. I had become unnecessary. When James grew up and became independent, when he started building his own life, I thought I would support him in every decision. He was my continuation. I rejoiced in his successes and was ready to forgive him any mistakes. But instead of gratitude, I received silence. A look that seemed to say, "You're not needed unless you can provide what I want." I continued to give him money, resources, but more and more, I felt like it was only enough to make him ignore me. I thought material wealth would be what kept him close. I was sure that when he needed support, he would turn to me. And all this time, putting so much effort into him, I didn't notice how he became more independent and, more importantly, more distant. It wasn't a drama. It was silence. I had become an unnecessary background in his life. Everything I had done no longer meant what I had hoped for in return. I think that moment, when I realized I wasn't important anymore, marked the beginning of my silence. I kept quiet because I couldn't understand what I had lost. I realized that I had been trying to build everything for him, not with him. I was sure that for James, my efforts meant as much as they did to me. But he decided that his life would be different. He didn't want the life I built. He wanted his own. And that was his right. But when I found out that I wasn't invited to his wedding, everything fell into place. Everything I had done for him had been for nothing. I sat in my office, listening to the news about the wedding, and suddenly realized I was no longer a part of this world. I had thought that achievements were what mattered most. But now I knew, true value lies in what you give to others, not in what you can afford yourself. I had spent years building a career, but I hadn't noticed how I was building walls between myself and those I loved. I thought everything would work for me, for my family. But I was wrong. When I heard it, everything in my head froze. James decided I wouldn't be at his wedding. Those words, spoken by the wedding planner, hit me like a punch I wasn't prepared for. I had always thought our bond was strong, that no matter the hardships, we were still a team. But it turned out I was wrong. Everything I had done for him, all my sacrifices, it was all for nothing. I had become nothing more than a source of money, someone now erased from his life. The emptiness inside me wouldn't let me go. I always thought that if I was successful, if I created everything for them, they would be proud of me. I thought they would appreciate my work, my patience, my efforts. But in that moment, I realized it wasn't enough for James. He had chosen his path, and I wasn't part of it. My life, my achievements, none of it mattered. I felt disappointment and pain, but I couldn't let it overshadow everything. I wasn't the kind of person who would lash out or argue. I knew that if I started to argue, if I tried to explain myself, I would only make it worse. I remained silent. I chose to step back. Not to fight for my place in his life, not to try and take back what he had already decided to give up. All I could do was quietly accept his decision, even though it felt unjust. As my eyes drifted over the papers on my desk, I realized how empty each success I had once considered important now felt. How many years had I spent building this business, how much effort had I put in, to make James successful and happy? And now I saw that all those years might not have been as important to him as I had thought. I had been willing to do everything for his happiness, but in the end, I had lost him in that moment. Silently sitting in my chair, I realized that I couldn't keep up this fight. If he didn't want me in his life, I wasn't going to force myself into it. And so, in the silence, I understood, I couldn't keep being the one who always gives, without receiving anything in return. It wasn't his fault. It was my choice. My silence, that was my strength, my way of protecting myself from the pain. At that moment, I decided that I needed to move forward, but not for him. I wasn't going to keep doing things that didn't bring me joy or recognition. He had chosen his path, and I had to find mine. I couldn't remain a background figure in my son's life. I had to reclaim my independence. With each passing day, as I continued to process the rejection, new thoughts kept forming in my mind. Action was necessary. I couldn't allow myself to break down or let everything I built crumble. I wasn't prepared for public arguments or drama. That's not my style. My strength lay not in words, not in shouting, but in how I could silently shift the course of events. If the wedding wasn't going to happen, I would make sure it didn't. I didn't scream, didn't create a scene, didn't threaten anyone. Instead, I used everything I had built, my company, my connections, my reputation. Through corporate channels, I quietly began to influence the critical aspects of the preparations. Slowly, without fanfare, I began canceling agreements, subtly interfering with the logistics, making sure the plans fell apart behind the scenes. I didn't need public gestures. Everything I did was calculated and controlled. I ensured that no one involved in the wedding planning immediately realized that changes were being made. The anticipation of all these people, their plans, their actions, it all started to become a waste of time, and the wedding began to fall apart. With every step, I controlled the situation, showing no anger, no irritation. This was my way of showing him that I wouldn't break something to reclaim my place unless it was for the sake of the betrayal itself. There was no need for me to be loud and brash. My power lay in the silence, in the absence of emotion, in how I orchestrated events to ensure they would collapse. I knew that everything I had accumulated over the years, all my experience, my strength, was behind every move. With every part of the wedding that fell away, I knew that this wasn't about revenge. It was a victory, not through scandal, not through conflict, but through the fact that I had regained control, without being humiliated. He didn't want me at his wedding? Fine. I wouldn't participate, but I would still take control. With every disappearing detail, I knew that this wasn't just about the wedding. It was about my life. And this was enough. When James found out the wedding was cancelled, he couldn't believe it. As soon as he got through to me, his voice was full of anger and resentment. He accused me of ruining his life, of trying to take everything from him, his happiness, his choice, his future. He didn't understand that I hadn't ruined his life. I had simply allowed myself to take back control. But to him, this was incomprehensible. His words came at me like sharp arrows, each one trying to hit me where I was most vulnerable. You don't understand. You ruined everything I built. You were always just about your business, and now you've taken it all away. He yelled, unable to see that it was his own actions that led to this moment. I remained silent. I didn't respond, didn't try to justify myself. I knew his words were an attempt to manipulate me, a way to regain control over a situation he had lost. He wanted me to be the one at fault again, to be the one responsible for his failures. He was looking for someone to blame, someone to deflect the responsibility from himself. I knew that if I answered, if I tried to explain, it would only intensify his attacks. I chose to stay silent. I let him be alone with his decisions. Silence, that was the one thing that terrified him. He thought his words would make me back down, that I would once again fight for his attention, for his approval. But I wasn't the same person who would fall into that trap again. I didn't want to be the one who always yielded. I wouldn't allow his manipulation to draw me back into the same old cycle. My silence was the signal he couldn't ignore. I was no longer his scapegoat, no longer someone who could be controlled. I was a person who was no longer afraid to remain silent, to stand my ground, even if it meant losing everything. His accusations were just words, losing their weight in my silence. And though it hurt that he didn't understand, I knew it was the right decision. I wasn't going to justify myself. I wasn't going to fall into that trap where his manipulations once again made me feel guilty. I was prepared to stand firm, because I knew that silence was my victory. When everything around me felt cold and incomprehensible, Laura was the one person who stood by me. Despite everything that was happening, I knew I could rely on her. I sat in my office, trying to keep my calm and not show weakness. But this internal crisis I was facing was something new, and I didn't know how to deal with the loneliness that had engulfed me. Laura came to me at the moment when I felt everything was falling apart. She had been adopted many years ago, and since then, she had become not just a daughter, but a true friend and support. We didn't often talk about what we had been through, but she always knew when I just needed someone by my side. When I heard her footsteps at the door, I realized I didn't have to hide my pain because she was there, ready to share it. She didn't try to change the course of events, didn't ask uncomfortable questions. Laura simply came, sat beside me, and silently supported me. She understood that even in those moments when I kept everything inside, I didn't need any extra words. I wasn't weak, I was just going through something that couldn't be explained. And in that moment, Laura became the support I didn't even realize I needed so much. Her presence in the room filled me with calm. There was no need for her to speak or try to console me with words. She didn't ask why I was silent, didn't try to persuade me to talk. She understood that in my own time, I would find my way through it. And although I was the kind of person who usually handled everything myself, I realized how important it was to be with someone who truly understood me, without expecting anything in return. I felt how her support, her silent strength, gave me confidence and comfort in a way I had not expected. There was no need for words. At that moment, I understood that despite everything going on, I had someone who didn't judge me, didn't ask for anything in return, and was there for me just because she cared. Laura became the person who reminded me that in life, it's not just about success and achievements, but about the people who are by your side when everything else seems lost and uncertain. She was my reminder that I wasn't entirely alone in this world. After all the emotional turmoil, I finally began to see things clearly. The silent resistance, the control over events, and Laura's support helped me realize that not everything in life is measured by status, success, or money. I understood that my energy and efforts should be directed to where they were truly valued, not in trying to earn the approval of someone who had rejected me. James made his choice, and I was no longer going to spend myself on seeking his recognition. Laura had become my true pillar. From the very first day she entered our lives, I felt in her a strength and wisdom that were rare. She understood the value of every decision, respected the effort I had put in, and shared my drive for order and fairness. That's why I decided to pass on my legacy to her. I saw in her the continuation of my work, the embodiment of the principles I had always lived by: hard work, honesty, striving for justice, and respect for the people you can count on. Passing my legacy to my daughter wasn't just a formality. It was an acknowledgement that she had become the person I could trust completely. I no longer felt the need to hold on to what I had lost with James. He walked away with his pride, and I accepted that. But Laura stayed, ready not just to inherit my business but to make it better, guided by the same values I had always considered fundamental. I remembered the years spent in offices, meetings, and endless business trips building Sterling Hospitality Group, all for the future of the family. Now I understood that true legacy is not just about material achievements but about the people you inspire, the ones you can lean on, the ones who will continue your path with respect for your principles. Laura was that person. In that moment, I felt a strange sense of peace. I no longer depended on my son's approval. I had passed everything I built into the hands of the person I trusted completely. And this wasn't an act of replacement or compensation, it was a true transfer of strength, trust, and the future. My mission was complete. And although the road to this realization hadn't been easy, I understood that now I could build my present and future, relying on those who truly stood by me, not on those who turned away. I saw in Laura not just a daughter, but a partner, a continuation of the ideas and values I had nurtured over the years. She was ready to take responsibility, to preserve my principles, and lead the company further, making it even stronger. This realization brought me peace. I no longer fought for a place in someone else's life. Now I knew that my legacy was in good hands. After passing on my legacy to Laura and realizing that I no longer had to seek solace from those who had rejected me, I knew it was time for a new beginning. I didn't want to stay in the past. I understood that despite all my achievements, there was something more important I could do with the strength that remained within me. I had endured loss, betrayal, loneliness, and despite all that I stood firm. But not all men can go through this. I saw how often they are forgotten by society, even by their own families, and I understood that I needed to do more than just watch their struggle. I decided to create a foundation to support men who, like me, had found themselves in difficult life situations. Men who had lost everything or faced betrayal, those who felt lonely and forgotten. This foundation would be a place where every man could find support, regain his pride, and rebuild his strength. I knew that in those moments when the whole world seemed against you, it was crucial not to feel alone. Many men suffer in silence, hiding their pain because they don't want to show weakness. I had been like that myself. First and foremost, the foundation was meant to be a symbol of the idea that nothing is lost, that there is a way back, even if you hit rock bottom. I had seen men who, after experiencing betrayal or loss, didn't know how to move forward. They lost not only their confidence but their sense of self. This foundation would be a place where they could feel that they weren't alone, that there were others who had been through similar experiences and could offer support. I thought it was important to not only help restore material well-being but also inner strength. Many men who had experienced loss felt devalued, unable to find meaning in life. This foundation could become their support, a place where they could find new goals and faith in themselves. It wasn't just about giving help. It was about restoring dignity, regaining honor. I knew that many men, especially those who had faced betrayal and loneliness, needed support but couldn't seek it because they were ashamed or afraid to admit their vulnerability. My foundation was meant to help them understand that seeking help was not a weakness. Rather, it was a step towards recovery and taking back control of their lives. It was my way of giving back what I myself had experienced, helping those who found themselves in the same situation I was once in. It was more important than any material possessions I had ever accumulated. I understood that many men, who at some point had lost everything, needed chances for a new life, for someone to believe in them when they themselves stopped believing. This foundation became something much more than just a project for me. It was my redemption, my chance to leave behind something more significant than money or property. The opportunity for others to find a new path and reclaim their life. I felt that, at last, my experience could help many. And perhaps, this was my most important step. After I passed the business on to Laura and established the foundation, I felt a strange freedom that I had never experienced before. I had always thought that if I kept working, if I kept building something for others, it would define my place in the world. I sacrificed myself for goals I thought were important, to be needed and valued by others. But now, having done everything I could and passed my work into reliable hands, I realized that I had finally freed myself from all these external expectations. I was no longer tied to the results and opinions of others. There was no longer a need to constantly prove my worth, no need to please those who expected more from me. Now I lived for myself. I realized that the values I had built throughout my life defined not only my past but my present and future. I was no longer bound by expectations. Now I made my own decisions about what mattered to me. I had often lost myself in the desire to please everyone around me. Afraid of losing respect, I always put others' interests above my own. But now I understood that true strength lies in the ability to let go of other people's standards and live according to my own beliefs. I no longer worried about what people would say. I stopped seeking approval and realized that everything I had been looking for had always been inside me. The process of passing the business on to Laura wasn't an act of surrender, but rather an act of liberation. I no longer needed that constant control, that battle for leadership and status. I knew she would continue my work, but in her own way, with the same principles that I had. And in that, I found my victory, not in holding everything under control, but in allowing someone else to take on part of my responsibility and move forward. Creating the foundation was an important step, but even more important was how this change affected me internally. I was no longer shackled by fear or guilt that I had missed something. I began to realize that everything I had done to the best of my ability. I had been true to myself. I felt that this new phase in my life had given me more than anything I had ever built before. My freedom was no longer about money or achievements, but about being a living example of how one can stay true to their principles and follow their own path. At that moment, I realized that true wealth isn't in what you've accumulated or left behind, but in what you feel inside. My inner strength. Now I knew that my path wasn't about meeting expectations, but about the path I had chosen for myself. And this feeling of freedom, this inner strength, was far more valuable than all the money and success I had once considered defining. Now I understood that life isn't about controlling everything and making it all bend to your will. You can be successful not only through external achievements, but also through inner harmony. I felt how I let go of everything that had held me for so long. I no longer sought approval, no longer lived under the weight of others' expectations. I realized that all I needed was to be true to myself. When I handed over the business to Laura and created the foundation, I felt an extraordinary freedom that I had never experienced before. I had freed myself from all the external expectations and obligations that once defined my life. The need to please others, to control every aspect of my existence, all of that was in the past. I stopped seeking justification and recognition because I realized that everything I had been looking for had always been inside me. This new stage became a true liberation. I was no longer connected to those who had turned away, or to those who didn't appreciate my efforts. I no longer felt pain from rejection or sought approval. Instead, I found peace in the realization that I had done everything I could and had entrusted my work to reliable hands. Laura wasn't just inheriting the business, she had become the person with whom I could look to the future without regrets. And I no longer felt alone, as I had before. Together, we began a new chapter of life, free from old grudges, mistakes, and attachments. Laura and I were no longer just father and daughter. We became partners who shared not only the business but also important values. We knew that a legacy is not just about money or success, but about what we can pass on to others. My true legacy now lay not only in business but in what I had created, the support of men through the foundation, the transmission of strength and confidence to those who found themselves in difficult life situations. Many men, like me once, face betrayal, loss, or loneliness. And I realized that my true purpose was to give them a chance to recover, to help them regain their belief in themselves. The foundation I created became more than just a project. It was a movement that gave many people, who found themselves in tough circumstances, the opportunity to rediscover their strength and their path. I knew that this foundation was my most important mission because I had lived through these moments myself, and now I could help others. Creating the foundation made me understand that true wealth is not in material possessions. I was no longer tied to external measures of success. I no longer feared losing what I once considered important. I had freed myself from the need to prove my worth to others. My strength now came from within, and I no longer needed anyone else to recognize it. I had passed my business to Laura, knowing she would continue it with respect for the same principles that I had upheld. At that moment, when I created the foundation, I also created space for my own inner freedom. I understood that my life no longer depended on the opinions of others. I no longer lived in fear that my efforts would be misjudged. My freedom was not in money or success. My freedom was in being true to myself and acting according to my own principles. Together with Laura, we started a new journey. We didn't forget about this legacy, but we didn't dwell on it either. We understood that it was important not only to continue the business but to think about how we would move forward, what we would pass on to others. And in this process, we no longer felt the need for recognition. We understood that our true achievement was not what we accumulated but what we could give to others. My path didn't end with handing over the business. It was only a transition that allowed me to move forward, untethered from the past. Laura continued what I had started, and I knew her path would not only be in business but also in what she would bring to the world through her actions and values. Closing this chapter, I felt that now I could move forward freely. My true legacy was not in buildings or sums in bank accounts. It was in what I had passed on to others, in support, in faith, in the opportunities one had given to those who needed help. That was what truly mattered. And when I stood next to Laura, I knew, in this new path, we were together, and we had everything to build the future, leaving the present behind.